soldiers that I've served with, the patients that I've had the great pleasure to care with, friends, family, and it's a tremendous honor to see you all here. And let me tell you a little bit about this book, because this book was literally a labor of love. And what I want to do in the time that I have, and we'll have questions after that, and then we'll have some book signings for those of you that have a book and want me to do that. I want to tell you a little bit about the history of the Naval SEAL teams, because a lot of people don't know where it all came from. We all know they're here, and we all know they're doing great things, but give you a little bit of history, and then I want to tell you about the training that a Navy SEAL goes through, which is 6 months of basic training followed by a year of follow-on training, all of which are in Coronado, California, before they're allowed to go to their SEAL teams and start their platoon train up. And then I want to tell you why these 6 days are so important to that year and a half of training. We'll start with history. The museum, which has just announced they're carrying my book and had ordered 50 copies, is in Fort Pierce, Florida. And that's where the main tourist attraction for the SEAL Historical Society basically exists. And they're there in Fort Pierce, Florida, because that's where the World War II scouts and raiders began their train up during World War II. We knew we needed in World War II some form of forward deployed waterborne force, and they started as scouts and raiders under a lieutenant commander, later Rear Admiral Kaufman, who then developed those into the underwater demolition teams, which were formed for the first time in 1943. We didn't have UDT teams till the later half of World War II. And then when we had them, we put them in the Pacific, we put them in the Atlantic, we put them clearing Tinian and Guadalcanal, and we put them at the beaches of Normandy, where casualties, I mean, not wounded but dead, were as high as 60-70% of the units that would go in to blow up the obstacles, against a withering fire from the beach, so that the landing craft could come safely and launch the Marines and the assault forces. So the UDT teams continued to exist from 1943 until 1983, 40 years later, when all the UDT teams were renamed SEAL teams. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, because the UDT teams operated on both coasts, east and west, and they formed a Naval Special Warfare Task Command structure that would operate them. And they went on until the 1960s, when, after the Korean War, somebody said, we have a problem here, because the UDT team's specific mission says it stops at the high water mark. At high tide, the highest it goes as far as the SEAL can take his mission, but in Korea that was a problem. We needed to go inland, and we needed people that came from the dark night seas. So somebody said, we might want to look at a way to expand their mission inland, and that's when the Navy was tasked under Admiral Arleigh Burke to explore the Navy expanding their mission inland, which meant we were going to go step on the toes of the Marines and the Green Berets and the folks that already owned that land mission. And interestingly, and I point this out in my book because it makes me chuckle, the Chief of Naval Personnel in 1960 was my grandfather, who was a 3-star admiral in charge of all naval personnel, and he fought vehemently against the Navy having anything to do with naval special operations. Give it to the Army, give it to the Green Berets, don't want the Navy to have it. Luckily, Granddad failed in his mission to keep it from happening, and the SEAL teams were formed in 1962 by the efforts of Admiral Arleigh Burke, which was actually begun under President Eisenhower. We give Kennedy credit for the formation of SEAL teams because he signed the document in 1962 that created one SEAL team on the East Coast and one on the West. So SEAL Team 1 on the West Coast, SEAL Team 2 on the East Coast was formed from the UDT teams that we had. Today, interestingly, there are 4 SEAL teams on each coast. There is SEAL Teams 1, 3, 5, and 7 on the West Coast, and there's SEAL Teams 2, 4, 8, and 10 on the East Coast. 2, 4, 8, 10. I see him. He skipped 6. There is a SEAL Team 6, but it doesn't fall under the command of the Naval Special Warfare Units. That's the group that took Osama bin Laden out of his hiding place. Then SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force operate under a completely separate chain of command, from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs to the Joint Special Operations Command to their forward deployed rapid response forces. Each one of those units would be on target within 4 hours after their beepers go off, and they SEAL Team 6 draws its men from the other SEAL teams, but they're not part of that chain of command. Also, interestingly, on those two coasts is one swimmer delivery vehicle team on each and one special boat unit on each. Those all fall under the command and control of our current Naval Special Operations Group. And I just, in researching the organization, discovered that the swimmer delivery vehicle teams are going to be granted by Congress the ownership of their very first ever dry submersible. Right now we operate SEALs in these little mini submarines that are electric powered wet submersibles that can stay underwater for 3 to 6 hours breathing on air that's kept in the submarine with you, but then all goes out the back. Now they're going to have actually their very first ever dry submarine, because it gets pretty ugly, and been there, done that, to sit in a submarine in wet water, cold water, when you're not using your muscles. All you're doing is just breathing and waiting to be launched on your mission. So that's a big step in the right direction. So that's the organization. Let's step ahead to how do we make these men? I already told you it's a year and a half of training, but that first 26 weeks is called BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. It consists of 3 phases, the first of which, phase 1, is basically being an Olympic training camp, but where the instructors aren't very nice to you. And in that first phase of 8 weeks, where they're trying to get you into the best physical shape you possibly can, Hell Week occurs. And I'll come back to that. That's 6 days of those 8 weeks. Second phase is the dive phase, where they're trained in their scuba diving and pure oxygen rebreathers, which is our tactical diving rig that makes no bubbles and has some depth limits, because it's actually dangerous to operate at deep levels. But it's non-magnetic, non-detectable, and we can swim for a very long time, 3 to 6 hours, with a little bottle of recirculated oxygen that allows you to navigate into bad guys' backyards and do what you need to do. Following that BUDS, you're given your graduation certificate from BUDS, and if you've made it that far, you're going to make it the rest of the way. But you've got an additional 1 year of training that used to be done by the teams, but is now kept at the Coronado, California Bucklew Center, named after what's considered the father of frogman, Admiral Bucklew, Captain Bucklew, I'm sorry, winner of 2 Navy Crosses in World War II. But they will go on and they will do survival, escape, and resistance training, both the basic and the advanced. The advanced being, what do you do when you're captured by a country that doesn't recognize the Geneva Convention and torture is permitted? That's a much longer course that they go through. They go through jungle warfare training, they go to winter warfare training, they go to advanced driving training, advanced weapons, advanced demolitions, free fall and static line parachuting, and that list goes on. And it takes a full year to get them through all of those courses, so they can then hand them to a SEAL team and go, okay, he's yours now. And that's when they get to wear the Budweiser. And this little pin here is called the Budweiser, because it looks a lot like Anheuser-Busch's symbol. And that's when you're officially a SEAL and you get to join your platoon. And then you begin another 3 to 6 month pre-deployment workup before you deploy with your unit. Oh, by the way, that I discovered in the last 2 years, they used to deploy my platoon and other platoons in small units. We talk about there's 4 SEAL teams on each coast. They got a swimmer delivery team. We're talking about maybe total 1,000 men out there. It's not big. A SEAL team consists of 3 to 4 platoons of 22 men each. So we're talking about a teeny tiny organization that has tremendous responsibilities. But now when we deploy a team to Afghanistan, we send the entire team. All 3 or 4 platoons move forward with their entire command structure and their support network, and they conduct operations with the men that they trained with. It's a marvelous operational scenario, and it has markedly reduced the casualties in our combat environments. So that's the SEALs, and that's where they come from. Why did I want to pick out these 6 days and talk about it separately? And I'll tell you this, over the years that I've read the books that we've only recently been allowed to write, I've noticed that every single one has a mention of Hell Week. And one of our guests here grabbed me and said, I just read that book by Marcus Luttrell, Lone Survivor, and I read about his Hell Week. And my comment back on that was, that's probably the best book I've ever read about a Navy SEAL adventure. But his mention of Hell Week was this big, and what the book really did was it identified why there is a Navy SEAL Hell Week. He could not have done what he did had he not been through Hell Week, is the bottom line. Had he been faced with the ability to give up, if he'd had learned the ability to give up, he would have never survived in the mountains of Afghanistan and come home to his family. So I kept saying, when is somebody going to write the book that allows me and any other frogman that's been through training to hand it to their family members and go, hey, this is what Hell Week is. This is what I did. And I called Dick Couch, who's an author of 20-some books, and said, write this book. And he goes, no, you write it. It's your guys, and you know it, and I can't do it for you. So 4 years it took me to pull the 11 men in my class aside one at a time and talk to them and say, look, I'm looking back as a doctor now. We've been on reunion after reunion, and we've got together, and we've said there were 70 of us when we started training, and only 11 of us graduated. Why us? What did we have in common? What's our common theme? Were we bigger, stronger, meaner? No. There had to be something. So after 20 years as a doctor, I thought, maybe I am somewhat uniquely qualified to go back and re-look at the men that made it with me and see if I could find that common theme. So that's what I did. I pulled them all aside and said, let's talk. Let's find out. What did you do as a kid? What did you do in high school? When did you decide to become a SEAL? What did you do in the Navy before going to SEAL team? And when you got there, how did that contribute to why you chose not to quit? Because that's the bottom line. To do this, you simply have to choose every minute of every day not to quit. And the why us discovery is in chapter 22, where I say, what I do in this story is I tell you about these men, and I tell you about their youth and their build-up and their decision to go into the teams and what they've done before going. And then I walk you through day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 of this. I walk you through the exhaustion. I walk you through the hallucinations, which we all experienced at days 5 and 6 from sleep deprivation and body temperatures that dropped well into the upper 80s that are, if any of the other doctors in this room know, is pretty much inconsistent with life as we know it. But they kept going and they kept doing it. And when I was all done, I realized that the theme is, I'm not ruining the book, by the way, by telling you the answer to this question, but as Dave Roby intimated, this book is not just about the SEALs and not just about what they did, but it's about what I discovered as a physician, that life can give to each and every one of us and to our friends and to our relatives. And I think it's a fascinating discovery that what I and my other classmates had in common is that life had already kicked the snot out of us. We had had some event prior to going to SEAL team that we had no control of, that we survived. And then when we got to SEAL training and they pushed us to, the goal of Hell Week is to push you to your absolute physical limits, where you cannot go on, where you're gonna go, I can't, instructor, I can't do one more push-up. Everybody gets to that physical limit at some point in time, and when you get there, all the instructors jump on you, kick you on, yell at you, and get your adrenaline going and make you step over that line. And as soon as you step over the line that your mind told you you can't go past, then that line ceases to exist. And so, just briefly, there were, of our 11, there were men that were brought up by alcoholic parents. There was a man who was so poor was spelled with 4 O's, and if he wanted meat on his table, he had to go shoot a squirrel with a slingshot. There was a man who was the bastard child of a 17-year-old who left him on the doorstep of 70-year-old chain-smoking parents who raised him because they felt it was their obligation, but for which there was no love. So his love came from his hockey games and his bar fights, and when he decided to become a SEAL, and he reached his end, and he stepped over the line, and he made it to the very end, he was able to look at his instructors and go, really? That's all you got? I see worse, And that was the key deciding factor. And when I tried to put it into words, what I come up with is that it's not that you chose to run a marathon and made it those 26 miles and achieved that goal. You had control over that event. You don't have control over the poverty you grew up, or the alcoholic parent, or the unloved environment that you grew up in. But if you survive that, no matter what that life experience is, you're going to be better, much better, for the next life challenge that comes along. And I'm going to stop by telling you that in this book, if there's any Marines here, by the way, there's pictures in the book. Okay, so but I'll show you my favorite picture. This is This is my Navy commander's uniform that I wore one time in my career, the day I was sworn into the Army as a second lieutenant to start all over again and go to medical school. But at the front of the book and at the end of the book is a quote by a man I discovered in my research about the Navy SEAL training, that he had been a prisoner of war, a Jewish prisoner of war in the Nazi concentration camps, and he wrote a book that many of you have probably been exposed to called Man's Search for Meaning. And I read that there was this one paragraph that really hit me. I said, as I'm researching why people do the impossible, choose to live, and he writes about prisoners of war that chose to die. And he was a psychiatrist in World War II, and he wrote this analysis, and I think it's a wonderful way of putting into words what every SEAL has to do when they're faced with that decision to move on or quit. And what he says is, when a man finds that it is his destiny to suffer, he will have to accept his suffering as his task, his single and unique task. He will have to acknowledge the fact that even in suffering, he is unique and alone in the universe. No one can relieve him of his suffering or suffer in his place. His unique opportunity lies in the way in which he bears this burden. And that's, I think it states the premise in the beginning and it reinforces it at the end. And I really hope you enjoy reading the story of the 11 men that I've had the great honor to know over the years, and some of the other men that I've had a great opportunity to work with. So with that, I'll say thank you for coming and open it to any questions that you might have. Sir?
How did you, what was the reason behind choosing the Army to go for your medical training rather than the Navy?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and it's actually boils down to something very simple. When I decided to go to med school at 30-some years old, I applied to the Army and the Navy for a military scholarship, because when I went to med school at 36 years old, I had 2 children and a wife to support. And the Navy offered me a 3-year scholarship, and the Army offered me a 4. And I put on my dress uniform, I went to the Navy, and I said, I'm going to med school. Government's going to pay for it. You need to match the offer. And they said, well, you didn't qualify for the 4. So I said, thank you, sir, for your time, and when we serve again, I'll be in a different uniform. In all honesty, it worked out very well. Navy SEALs do a whole lot more land operations and forward deployed stuff, where the medical units that I ended up working with would have been the ones I dealt with in the SEAL teams, and not a lot of time on ships. And I did spend a year and a half on a destroyer before being able to go to SEAL training, and because there were only 5 SEAL slots at the Naval Academy. There were 890 of us that had a chance to choose, and they were gone before I had a chance to choose. So I was on a destroyer, which I'm very, very grateful for, because I disliked it immensely. And when it came time to quit or move on, a little voice in my head said, you quit, you're going back to that ship. So, it worked out well. And right now, of interest, for those of you that are interested in what's going on in the military, there are now 130 SEAL candidates at this year's class at the Naval Academy, vying for 30 slots. And they've increased the number of SEAL opportunities out there. Yes, sir.
When you were going through BUDS training, did the people who rang the bell or opted out, did they surprise you? Was the bell ringing or opting out, was it gradual and built up to Hell Week, or what was your experience?
So why is there a bell on here? This is the bell that a SEAL has to ring 3 times when he quits. And a bell that we're allowed to ring in celebration 3 times when we're done. Ding, 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 you didn't get me. But, and I talk about some of the quitting events in the book, but it's always a surprise when somebody decides to say no. Some of them quit in the first hour of Hell Week when the break, and it starts at midnight on a Sunday and it ends the following Saturday, and at midnight on Sunday it begins with automatic weapons and loud flashbangs and water and dark, and it's scary. And some people go, well, out of here. But every single one of us in the path coming up said, we're not going to quit, we'll never quit, we'll support you, we'll be here for you. And then at some point in time, in all honesty, the simple reason is they haven't failed before. They just stand up, get up, and walk away. And And it's always a surprise when it happens, you don't know. But the Navy has always been very confused, and hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent just to learn what I've discovered. I'm expecting a check in the mail anytime soon. That the star quarterbacks, the greatest athletes that would come here going, my next achievement is gonna be Navy SEAL, they don't make it. Because they've always dated the prettiest the prettiest cheerleader, they've always been successful at everything they've done, and when they're faced with what is literally unimaginable, they go, I got other things I can do. Thank you. So that's, always a surprise. In the back, sir.
Colonel, what if you consider ringing the bell?
No, sir, not ever, not once. I thought I was gonna die twice. Seriously, I thought I was gonna freeze to death, but I kept saying, you know what? I know, because I'm Naval Academy, I've been around enough military, they're gonna resuscitate me. They'll try to bring me back. No, it never, ever, ever crossed my mind. And most of the men that graduated tell me the same thing. Never, ever crossed their mind. At least one of my classmates, when I interviewed him, I said, tell me what you remember. He goes, absolutely nothing. Those 7 days were a complete blur to him. He said, and I'm not kidding when I said body temperatures dropped into the upper 80s. They checked that, and nowadays they still are very, very careful about monitoring the hypothermia in training. They let you get there, but they don't get you to the point where you're gonna have a heart attack and die from it. Yes, sir.
Colonel, what if there's a future book about your services with the 82nd Airborne in Delta?
That book is in outline form as we speak, sir, thank you. But it's gonna be called Doctor Stories.
Right.
Because my service with the 82nd Airborne, it was in Iraq, and my service with Delta was in countries that are classified for a number of years, but the doctor stories with the patients that I took care of are just fascinating. And these stories are from the heart, and when I talk about my physician experiences, they'll be the same thing.
We'll be waiting